Welcome to our October edition of This Month in Math. Mrs. Hill, would you like to tell our kinder families what they'll be learning about in the month of October?
Absolutely. So we're going to be focusing on 4 foundational skills with your kindergartner. First is counting skills. Next would be number sense, then measurement, and lastly, graphs. Through these videos that we plan to send out to you each month, we're going to be sharing what those standards look like for your student, but also showing you practical ways of how you can put these skills to use and work with them at home as well.
The first skill we're going to talk through is counting. They need to be able to rote count to 30 at this stage in kindergarten. What might that look like, Mrs. Hill?
So rote counting is when they are counting like 1, 2, 3, 4 consecutively and in order.
What happens if they make a mistake?
That's a great question. We definitely want to make sure that we're working with them on how to self-correct, that they are paying attention when counting specifically up to 10, that if they make an error, that they are correcting themselves.
So if they're able to count to 30, what might that lend itself to then?
So this would lend itself to another part of the standard they're expected to be able to do, and that's counting a group of objects of up to 10 objects with one-to-one correspondence. So what that might look like, I have 10 blocks here. A student being able to do that, they're touching one block at a time and counting 1, 2, 3, and so on. Again, if they make any type of error, helping them to learn to self-correct is huge at this point.
When they're counting, do they need to be grouping in a certain way at this stage?
Not at this time. They are specifically counting and they can line them up in a straight line, or they can count them into a separate pile. However, as they get into the older grades, especially in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade, when we start talking more about multiplication, this would lend itself to them being able to put them into groups if they're counting and we're starting multiplication. They might count into a group of 2 and then line up the next one next to it, almost building a type of array. But that's down the road from kindergarten. However, that is how it's going to look when they get to that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I agree, like setting these early foundational skills are extremely important, and mathematics, one thing builds on top of the other before you know it, allowing them to kind of really build their mathematical skills throughout.
Absolutely. And if your child is ready to go beyond, we definitely encourage you to work with them on that. The standard at this point is counting to 30, but if a child can go past that, absolutely encourage them to keep counting as far as they can go without making a mistake.
Mrs. Hill, what might that look like at home? Like parents may not have these colored blocks to use, so how can they practice with their students at home?
You can truly use anything. So you could use dry cereal, pasta, coins. It doesn't have to be objects all that are the same. The point and the focus is on them being able to touch and count one-to-one correspondence. Our next skill is number sense. So the first part of this skill is being able to read and write numbers up to 10. So what might that look like?
So if you are reading and writing numbers up to 10, you need to be able to recognize. So if this is the digit 2, students need to be able to identify that this is a 2. Okay, so they might see this, a teacher might provide them with something that they can see it on. However, they also need to be able to write their digits 1 to 10. So that really is your child actually being able to write 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on up to 10.
You can absolutely use a yellow crayon or even a highlighter as well to help your child with forming those numbers on a piece of paper, or feel free to use a whiteboard or marker as well, or go outside and in the dirt with your finger, being able to build those numbers and write them as well.
I'm glad you mentioned in the dirt. Lots of great ways to kinesthetically help students do this. If you have a tray of rice at home, even allowing them to kind of form those letters with Play-Doh, so they're working on those larger muscles before they're really working the fine motor skill of creating the number. Chalk outside, they're able to hold the big piece of chalk, which is often more helpful when forming the letter before they're actually being expected to kind of hold a pencil or a marker.
So the next skill coming after this one would be building a set of objects with a number up to 10. So what might that look like?
So here I have 20 blocks in total. We're not expecting them to be able to build a set up to 20. We want them to be able to build a set up to 10. So you might ask them, please create a set of 7. And so then again, we're going to remember that we're really working on that one-to-one correspondence. So we're going to layer that in here. So really getting them to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The important part is students often forget the number they counted to. So you might have asked them to build to a set of seven, and they might have successfully done that. But what you need to do is follow up with the question, how many is there? And you'll be surprised that at first they might just give you a random number like 5, 12, whatever kind of number comes to mind, because they're not really holding on to the quantity of the set that they built. So they need lots of practice, and we'll give them lots of practice here at school. But the same thing, if you have them building a set at home, just following up with that question, how many is in that set, and getting them to kind of recognize how many is in that set. If they can't do that successfully right away, ask them to recount. Again, so using that one-to-one correspondence to build to 7.
I agree. And as they become more used to this practice, you can even cover it so that they're not tempted to count once they have solidified that skill, to be able to make sure that they're holding on to that number.
That's a very good idea.
Go ahead. This actually leads us into the second part of this, where they're having to read the amount of the quantity that they built and be able to record that number down.
Yeah. So once they've done this, the next step, once you've had some successful practice with them, the next step would be to ask them, can you write the number that you just built in your set? Okay, so once they're pretty successful at this skill, the next thing we really need to be working on is, can they build a separate set that allows them to compare to that set? So you might ask them, can you build a set with fewer blocks? Or can you build a set with a larger amount of blocks? So the idea would be that if they built a set of 7 here, if you said, can you build a set with more blocks or a greater amount of blocks, that they'd be able to, again, use one-to-one correspondence to build a greater set. So they might go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now they've built a set of 8, which is larger than the first set of 7. If they are not using the mathematical vocabulary, such as fewer or greater, then you might prompt them by asking them questions. Which set has more? Which set has fewer? Can you tell me the difference between these two sets? That way you're getting them to kind of reinforce that mathematical vocabulary that we're using here at school.
And the next session is measurement. So on your screen, you're going to see a calendar for the month of October, and your kindergartner is expected to identify and sequence the days of the week. What that means is they need to understand what each day is out of the week and what order those days are set in, or that they would see in the calendar, starting at Sunday, going Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Also, you're wanting to make sure your kindergartner understands that there are 7 days in total in the week.
Thank you for mentioning that we start with Sunday in the American school system, because oftentimes you see on websites, there's things that start on Monday and they go through Sunday. There's things that even start sometimes on Saturday. So here at school, for the purposes, we are starting with Sunday, correct? And then we work our way to the 7th day being Saturday.
Yes.
I think that's great. Our next piece of measurement is what?
So when we're talking about length and comparing using vocabulary such as length and height with different measurement pieces. So for example, we're using cubes that we have snapped into towers. Okay. So tell us a little bit more about, what does length mean?
Okay. So often these words are used very interchangeably. So we just want to make sure, if you're practicing at home, you can kind of talk through with your kiddo what we mean when we say length. So for example, these orange Unifix cubes that Mrs. Hill said we kind of snapped together, when we're talking about the length of something, we're talking about how long it is. So how long these orange Unifix cubes are. Height would look like how tall something is. So how tall are these orange Unifix cubes? The next part of this piece is they really need to be able to compare items. So if I were comparing this tower of yellow Unifix cubes to the tower of orange, we might get students to think about how much taller is this yellow set of Unifix cubes than this orange one, or how much shorter is the orange set of Unifix cubes to the yellow. So we really want to start working on their comparison vocabulary when they're looking at items. This will be a beautiful overlap into science, where they're also using other comparison words. So just kind of thinking through how you can support them at home. What are some outside activities, if we're not using a specific thing, Ms. Hill, can you think of where parents might be able to be using that comparison vocabulary at home?
I would think anything, first of all, that you could align up together, making sure that the ends are lined up correctly. So that could look like cars, or it could look like books that you could lay next to each other, or anything in the kitchen like different cans of different sizes that they can align up going lengthwise or in determining their height and how they would compare.
I would also look for things in your outside environment too. So what's happening in the outside environment that you might be able to get them to draw some comparison. So even if it's not length or height, what comparison words can you use to look at things? And really just kind of developing that comparison vocabulary, and that's going to support from now until future grade levels as well. Okay. So I think the next thing we're going to talk about is graphs, correct?
Yes. So we are going to be students will be creating simple object graphs. Do you want to share a little bit more about what an object graph is?
Yes, and you're going to see pop up on your screen an example of an object graph. Some people get this confused with maybe a pictograph. And the difference is with an object graph, you're really looking at the specific object we might be talking about. So on your screen, you're going to see some fall-related items and the exact picture or object that's on that graph. And so students are going to be creating graphs with specific objects. So if we're looking at pumpkins, apples, and leaves, on the graph you might have, there's 1 pumpkin, 2 leaves, 3 apples. And so we're going to begin asking questions. How many more pumpkins, or how fewer pumpkins there are than maybe leaves? How many more apples are the leaves? So again, using that kind of comparison vocabulary, getting them to understand, being able to look at this graph and figure out what data are we pulling from that. So what do we see about the graph?
Yes, and the key thing is these are simple questions they're answering, and also making sure you follow up their answer with, well, how do you know? So that helps them to support their answer. How do you know there are more pumpkins than there are apples? And they are counting those objects and being able to support their answer.
Okay, thank you for joining us for our Kinder October this month in math. We really enjoyed going over what your child's going to be learning in October.
Yep, we'll see you for next month.